The rain came down hard on the Buckingham Palace courtyard, turning the gray stone slabs into a dark, mirrored surface that reflected the somber afternoon sky. Corporal James Holloway of the Royal Guard stood at his post, a figure of rigid discipline and tradition, his bearskin hat heavy with moisture. He had stood guard through dozens of storms, through scorching heat, and through the endless parade of tourists. But nothing in his 10 years of service had prepared him for the conversation he overheard that day. It was a quiet Tuesday, one of those lulls between the grand state visits and the changing of the guard ceremonies that drew the crowds. The corridor inside the palace, just beyond the doorway where James was stationed, was supposed to be empty. It was a service passage, used by staff to move between the family's private quarters and the formal reception rooms. But James's orders were simple: stand watch and remain unobtrusive. The first sign that something was different was the voice. High-pitched, innocent, and utterly unfiltered. The voice of a child. Prince Louis, the 6-year-old whirlwind of the Wales household, came skipping around the corner, his school uniform slightly disheveled, his tie pulled loose. He was talking animatedly to someone, and James braced himself for the appearance of a frantic nanny or a protective protection officer. But the little prince was alone, chattering to himself as children often do, his words echoing off the ancient stone walls. And then the caterpillar ate through 3 plums, but he was still hungry, Louis recited to the empty corridor, acting out the story with his hands. James allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile beneath his stoic expression. He had children of his own. He knew the world of wonder they lived in. He assumed the prince would skip past him, lost in his own world, and then disappear into the kitchens or the gardens. But Louis stopped. He had spotted something on the floor, a tiny, discarded button from a footman's uniform. He picked it up, examined it like a treasure, and then looked up, directly at James. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Louis grinned. "Hello," he said, not with the shyness of a child meeting a stranger, but with the easy confidence of someone who owned every brick of the place. "I'm Louis. Have you lost a button?" Before James could formulate a response that wouldn't breach protocol, another voice cut through the quiet. It was deeper, older, belonging to a boy on the cusp of adolescence. "There you are! We've been looking everywhere!" A teenager appeared behind Louis. He had fair hair and a slightly imperious air, the kind of confidence worn by those born into immense privilege. James recognized him immediately from the briefings. It was Louis Lopes, the one of Queen Camilla's grandsons from her daughter, Laura. He was 14, attending the palace for a private family lunch. With him was his twin brother, Gus. "There's a guard here," Louis announced to his older cousin, pointing at James as if he were a piece of palace furniture. "He's very still." Louis Lopes barely glanced at James. To him, the guards were part of the scenery. "Come on, Grandma's waiting, and don't touch that. It's dirty," he said, glancing at the button in Louis's hand. And the difference in their demeanor was stark. Louis of Wales was all bright-eyed curiosity, a child still exploring the world with wonder. Louis Lopes, despite his youth, carried himself with the stiffness of someone who understood his place and the importance of being seen in the right light. James had seen the reports of the coronation, how Queen Camilla's grandchildren had played a prominent role, standing alongside her, robed and honored, while the younger Wales children watched from the sidelines. It wasn't his place to have an opinion on royal dynamics, but the contrast was impossible to miss. "I'm keeping it," little Louis declared, pocketing the button defiantly. "It's for my collection." Sensing a potential tantrum or a delay, Louis Lopes sighed. "Fine, keep it. Just come on." He started walking, expecting to be followed. Gus trailed behind him, silent. But little Louis didn't move. Instead, he looked at the older boy with an expression that was startlingly perceptive for a 6-year-old. "Where are we going?" To see Grandma, Louis Lopes replied, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. She's not my grandma, Louis stated, with the simple, unarguable logic of a child. It wasn't said with malice. It was just a fact. Queen Camilla was his grandfather's wife. His own grandmother was Diana, the one whose picture his daddy kept in a special frame. Louis Lopes stopped. He turned around and James saw a flicker of something cross his face, annoyance perhaps, or the awkwardness of a truth that adults tiptoed around. He was old enough to understand the complexities of his family, but perhaps not old enough to navigate them with grace. No, he agreed, his tone shifting to something slightly patronizing. But she's my grandma, and we have to be there for the photos. It's important. We have to stand with her. Why? Little Louis pressed, and his curiosity insatiable. Is it because you're carrying her robe? Daddy said you were pages of honor. That's like being a helper, right? I helped Mummy bake a cake once. It fell over. Gus snickered, but Louis Lopes remained serious. He seemed to view this interaction not as a conversation between cousins, but as a test. He drew himself up, trying to look taller, more important. It's not like baking a cake, he corrected. It's a duty. But we were standing with Grandma at the most important day of her life. The whole world was watching. We had to look perfect. We had to be perfect. He stressed the word we, subtly excluding the younger boy from that inner circle. Even Gus here had a broken arm, and he still had to do it. It doesn't matter if you're hurt or tired, you just do it. Little Louis processed this information, his little brow furrowed. My cousin George carried Granddad's robe. He said it was heavy, but he got to stand on the balcony. His voice held a note of genuine curiosity, not envy. Did you get to stand on the balcony? This was the crux of it. The balcony. The ultimate symbol of royal unity and hierarchy. At the coronation, after the service, the working royals had gathered on the famous balcony to wave to the crowds. Prince George, as a future king, had been there. Charlotte and Louis, as the children of the heir, had been there. But the Lopes twins, despite their role inside the abbey, had not. They had watched from a window, or perhaps not at all. Louis Lopes's composure cracked, just for a second. James, trained to read micro-expressions in crowds to spot potential threats, saw it clearly. A flash of something raw and resentful passed through the teenager's eyes. It was the look of someone who had been given a starring role in the play, only to be told they couldn't attend the after-party. That's different, Louis Lopes said, his voice tight. That's for the direct line. We had a different job, an important job. Oh, said little Louis, seemingly satisfied with the answer. He skipped ahead a few steps, then stopped and looked back at his cousin. But you're still family, aren't you? You're Grandma Camilla's family, so why don't you live here? We live here sometimes. My room has a slide, not a real slide, but a bed that looks like a slide. It was an innocent question. A child trying to piece together the confusing puzzle of his enormous blended family. But to Louis Lopes, it was a dagger. Why didn't they live here? Because their claim was through marriage, not blood. Because their grandmother was the queen consort, not the queen regnant. Because they were the other grandchildren, the ones from the first marriage, welcome at the table but not at the head of it. They have their own house, Gus mumbled, finally speaking. He sounded defensive. It's nice, Louis Lopes added quickly. Too quickly. It's really nice. We have horses. Little Louis's face lit up. I love horses. Mummy says when I'm bigger I can learn to ride properly. Do you ride? Can we go now? Is it far? The rapid-fire questions and the sudden burst of enthusiasm overwhelmed the older boy. He looked at Louis, this small, untroubled child who moved through the palaces with the easy grace of someone who belonged by right of birth, not by invitation. And he belonged to the future king, not just to the queen. Everything was easy for him. The world was his slide-shaped bed. "No, we can't go now," Louis Lopes snapped, his patience finally breaking. "We have to go inside. Stop asking so many questions. You're being a handful, you know that? Grandma said so. She said you were a handful." The words hung in the damp air of the corridor. James felt his blood run cold. He knew about the handful comment. Everyone did. It had been in the papers. And a seemingly innocent quip from the Queen about having a Louis grandson who was quite a handful. The palace had quickly clarified she meant her own grandson, Louis Lopes, not Prince Louis. But now, here was Louis Lopes himself, throwing that clarification back in the face of a 6-year-old, twisting it into an insult. Little Louis stopped skipping. He stopped smiling. He just looked up at his older cousin, his big eyes wide with a sudden dawning hurt. He understood the tone, if not the full context. He knew he was being told he was too much, that he was a problem. The silence stretched, thick and painful. James wanted to intervene, to step forward and shield the little boy from the cruelty of the teenager's words. But he was a statue. He couldn't move. Just then, a door further down the corridor opened. A warm light spilled out, and with it the sound of laughter. Princess Catherine stepped out, looking elegant and composed. "Louis, there you are, my love. It's time for lunch." Her eyes swept the scene, taking in her son's still face, and the stiff, slightly flushed expressions of the Lopes twins. She didn't need a report. A mother's intuition told her everything. She walked towards them, her heels clicking softly on the stone. She didn't scold or demand explanations. She simply knelt in front of her son, her beautiful dress puddling on the damp floor, and tucked a strand of hair behind his ear. "Did you find an adventure?" she asked softly. Louis nodded, but he didn't mention the button. He just leaned into her, seeking comfort. "Can we go now?" he asked quietly. "We can," she said, standing up and taking his hand. She looked at the older boys, and her smile, though still present, didn't quite reach her eyes. "Louis Gus, I believe the Queen is expecting you in the drawing room. You know the way." It was a polite dismissal. They knew it. They nodded mutely and hurried past her, disappearing through the door from which she had come. Catherine watched them go, her expression unreadable. Then she looked down at her son, squeezed his hand, and led him away in the opposite direction, towards the family's private quarters, away from the politics, away from the hurtful words. And Corporal James Holloway was left alone in the corridor, trembling. He had stood firm through storm and shine, but the quiet cruelty of a teenager's words and the dignified rescue by a mother's love had shaken him to his core. He thought of his own children, of the brutal, unthinking words kids could say to each other. He thought of the little prince, his joy dimmed by a cousin's resentment. He thought of the look on Louis Lopes's face, not just anger, but a deep-seated insecurity masked by arrogance. He understood now. This wasn't just a family. It was a battlefield, where the weapons were words and the scars were invisible. The grand titles, but the palaces, the crowns, they meant nothing in the face of a child's hurt. All that mattered was the hand reaching down to lift you up and lead you away from the darkness. And tonight, that hand had belonged to a mother. James adjusted his stance, his face a mask of stone once more, but inside, the image of that small, confused face and the sound of those careless words, "Grandma said you were a handful," would stay with him forever. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the palace, in the quiet corners where the public never saw, the real, raw, and often painful story of this family continued to unfold. Safety is an illusion.